The shuttle docked with a deep metallic groan, and Elias Mwangi pressed his face to the viewport to get his first look at Nexus 7, the largest orbital academy station in the Galactic Concord, a spinning ring of steel and glass that housed over 3,000 students from dozens of alien species, all of them here to learn how to talk to each other without starting wars. He was 14 years old, and he was alone. The airlock hissed open, and a wave of recycled air hit him, cold, and carrying the faint chemical sweetness that every space station seemed to share, no matter how far from Earth it floated. And Elias picked up his single duffel bag and stepped through the threshold into his new life. The corridor beyond was enormous, wide enough for species that walked on 6 legs, or hovered on gas bladders, or simply took up more room than any creature had a right to. And Elias felt immediately and completely small, not just physically, but in every way a person could feel, small when dropped into a place that was not built for him. A Thesic administrator met him at the gate, an insectoid the color of rusted copper, with compound eyes that reflected Elias back at himself in 100 tiny copies. And the administrator clicked its mandibles in what Elias had been taught was a polite breeding, before handing him a datapad with his room assignment and class schedule and a map of the station that looked more like the blueprint of a small city than a school. "You are the 7th human student aboard Nexus 7, the administrator said in flat translated speech. "You will find the others in Residential Block 9. Welcome to the Concord Education Initiative." Elias thanked it, and walked alone through corridors that buzzed with alien life. He passed Valley students, who glowed soft blue and pink from bioluminescent patches on their skin, their bodies thin as reeds, and their eyes wide and dark like deep water. And he passed a cluster of Marathi, who communicated in subsonic rumbles he could feel in his chest, more than hear. And he passed a group of Dralith, who towered over everything and everyone, each one at least 7 feet tall, with thick scaled hides and 4 muscular arms and jaws that could crack stone. The Dralith noticed him, and one of them turned its head slowly to track him as he passed, the way a predator might notice a small animal crossing an open field, not with hunger exactly, but with the casual awareness of something that had never once in its life needed to be afraid. Elias kept his eyes forward and kept walking. His room was small and plain and perfect, a bunk and a desk and a viewport that looked out at the slow rotation of stars. And he set down his bag and sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath he had been holding since the shuttle left Earth orbit. He had not asked to come here, not exactly, but he had not refused either, because when the United Earth Education Board offered a transfer slot to Nexus 7, you did not say no. Not if you were a kid from the lower orbital district of Nairobi, with a dead father and a mother working double shifts on a cargo freighter, and an uncle who had told you since you were old enough to stand that the only way out was through. So here he was, through and through, alone on a station full of aliens who had never met a human, and did not seem particularly interested in changing that. He found the other human students the next day, 6 of them, including himself now, and they were nice enough, but careful in the way humans always were when they knew they were outnumbered, polite and quiet, and trying very hard not to take up too much space. And Elias understood that instinct, because it lived in him too, but it also made something in his chest tighten with a feeling he could not name. The first week passed in a blur of orientation lectures and species etiquette briefings, and meals in a dining hall the size of an aircraft hangar, where the food came in 30 different biochemical profiles, and the human options were tucked into a small corner near the back wall as if they were an afterthought. It was during one of those meals that Elias met Lyra. She was Valley, thin and luminous, with skin that shifted between pale blue and soft violet depending on her mood, and she sat down across from him without asking, because apparently Valley did not consider that rude, and she said, "You are the new Earthborn," not as a question, but as a fact, and Elias said, "Yeah," and that was the beginning of the only real friendship he would make in his first month aboard the station. Lyra was kind and curious, and completely unafraid of humans, in a way that most other species were not. Because most other species looked at humans and saw something small and soft and fragile. A species that had only joined the Concorde 11 years ago, and still carried the label Provisional next to its name in every official database. A species without claws or venom or armored skin or any of the things the galaxy considered necessary for respect. Lyra saw something else, but Elias was not sure what. She warned him on the third week. "There is a Draelith named Torvin Kale," she said one evening as they sat in the observation lounge, watching a gas giant turn slowly in the distance. "He has been talking about you." "About me specifically?" "About humans, but you are the newest, and Torvin does not like new things he cannot control. His family holds a seat on the Concorde Security Council, and he believes this makes him untouchable, and so far he has been correct." Elias nodded slowly, and said nothing. "He hazes new students," Lyra continued, her skin flickering a worried shade of amber. "The smaller species, the quieter ones, he takes their food, or blocks their paths, or says things designed to make them feel worthless. No one reports him, because his family name carries weight, and because he is Draelith, and Draelith are warriors, and no one wants to be the one who provokes a warrior." "I appreciate the warning," Elias said. "You do not seem worried." "I am not." Lyra studied him for a long moment with those dark, wide eyes, and Elias could tell she was reading him with the low-level empathic sense that all Vayli possessed, feeling the surface of his emotions the way a person might feel the temperature of water before stepping in. Whatever she felt made her blink. "You are strange for a human," she said. "I get that a lot." That night, Elias went to the station's low-gravity gym, which was mostly empty at that hour because most species did not exercise the way humans did. And he wrapped his hands and worked the heavy bag for an hour, with combinations his uncle had drilled into his bones since he was 9 years old. Hooks and crosses and elbows and knees, and the bag swung and shuddered under impacts that would have surprised anyone who judged force by the size of the fist delivering it. Afterward, he sat on the gym floor and stretched and breathed and tried not to think about a Draelith named Torvin Kale. He failed. In the dining hall the next day, Torvin made his presence known, standing at the center of a table surrounded by his clique of Draelith and allied species students, four-armed and towering and loud, his voice carrying across the hall like a rumble of thunder as he told a joke that ended with the phrase, "gravity-chained runts." And the laughter that followed was the kind of laughter that was not really about humor at all, but about power. About reminding everyone in the room who sat at the top and who crawled at the bottom. Elias heard it, and he felt the 6 human students around him go still, the way prey goes still. And he picked up his fork and kept eating and said nothing. Torvin looked over at the human table and smiled. Smile. P. It was the smile of someone who had just chosen his next target. The classroom smelled like ozone and chalk dust and the faintly sour scent of Marathi's stress pheromones. And 36 students from 11 different species sat in tiered seating that curved upward like the inside of a bowl, while Instructor Vaughn stood at the center and activated the holo display with a click of his forelimbs. Vaughn was Thesic, tall and angular, with a segmented body the color of old iron, and compound eyes that never seemed to blink. And he taught interspecies biology and conduct with the flat efficiency of someone who had been doing it for decades and had long since stopped being impressed by anything. Today we examine the Comparative Physical Threat Index, Vaughn said, and the holo display bloomed into a rotating chart of species ranked by a dozen different metrics, including mass and striking force and natural weaponry and dermal resistance and toxin capability and speed and sensory range. At the top sat a Draelith, glowing gold on the chart, followed by the Marathi and the Kael'vrin, and half a dozen other species that had evolved claws or armor or venom, or all three at once. Near the bottom, nestled between a species of burrowing herbivores and a race of semi-aquatic filter feeders, sat Homo sapiens, highlighted in a dull gray that seemed almost apologetic. The number next to the human entry read 2.4 out of 10. A ripple of amusement passed through the classroom, not loud enough to be called laughter, but present enough to be felt, and Elias sat in the back row and watched the chart with an expression that could have been carved from wood. Lyra sat beside him, and she glanced at his face and then at his hands, and saw that his fingers had curled slowly into fists beneath the desk. Not in anger exactly, but in something quieter and heavier, something like patience being tested. "Does that bother you?" she whispered. "They are measuring the wrong things," he said. She waited for him to explain, but he did not. After class, Elias walked the long corridor back to the residential block, and Torvin was waiting. Not obviously waiting, not standing in the middle of the hallway with his arms crossed like a villain in a story, but leaning against the wall with two of his clique members flanking him, positioned exactly where Elias would have to pass. And when Elias approached, Torvin shifted his weight just enough to block the path and looked down at him with those slit-pupiled eyes and smiled. "Little Earther," Torvin said, "I saw your species on the chart today, 2-4. That is very sad. Even the Pilkeen score higher, and they eat moss." Elias stopped and looked up at him, and the height difference was almost absurd. Torvin nearly 3 feet taller and twice as wide, forearms thick with scaled muscle, a creature built for violence on a fundamental biological level. "Excuse me," Elias said quietly. "I need to get through." Torvin did not move. "Wonder," Torvin said, leaning down so his face was closer to Elias. Close enough that Elias could smell the iron and copper scent of Draelith breath. "Why the Concord even lets your kind in here? Provisional species? You are guests in our galaxy. You should behave like guests." "I am behaving," Elias said. "For now," Torvin said, and then he stepped aside with an exaggerated sweep of his upper arms, like a lord granting passage to a servant, and Elias walked through the gap, without quickening his pace or lowering his eyes. That night he could not sleep, and so he lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, and let his mind go backward, back through the stars and the void, and the orbital transit stations, back down through the atmosphere and the clouds, back to Nairobi, back to his uncle's gym in the lower district, where the walls were concrete, and the floor was cracked rubber, and the air always smelled like sweat and old leather. Marine for 12 years, before a knee injury sent him home. And he had taken one look at his dead brother's skinny son, and decided that the universe was not going to eat this boy. Not if he had anything to say about it. "You are small," Uncle Davi had told him on the first day, wrapping Elias's hands with tape that smelled like eucalyptus. "You will always be small compared to something, on this planet or off it. But small is not weak. Do you understand me?" Elias had not understood, not then, but his uncle had been patient and relentless. And over the years the understanding had come, beaten into his muscles and his bones through thousands of hours of Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing, and something his uncle simply called the real lesson. The real lesson was this: everything that makes a bigger opponent powerful also makes them predictable. Their size creates momentum they cannot redirect. Their strength encourages them to overcommit. Their reach makes them predictable. Them careless at close range. And their confidence, above all their confidence, makes them blind. "Earth made you dense, boy," Uncle Davi had said, tapping Elias on the sternum with 2 fingers. "Dense bones, dense muscle, dense tendons. You come from a world that pulls at you every second of every day with a force most species in this galaxy would call brutal. You are a compressed spring, and the thing about compressed springs is that most people do not realize what they are until they release. On Nexus 7, lying in his bunk light years from home, Elias pressed his palm flat against the wall and felt the cold metal and remembered. The escalation came in stages over the following 2 weeks. Slow enough to seem accidental if you were not paying attention, fast enough to feel inevitable if you were. First, it was words, always in public, always loud enough for others to hear. Comments about humans being pets and parasites and provisional embarrassments, and Torvin's clique would laugh, and the other students would look away, and the human students would shrink a little smaller in their seats. Then it was contact, a shoulder check in the corridor that sent Elias stumbling into a wall, a tray knocked from his hands in the dining hall, with a muttered, "Watch yourself, little earther," a deliberate block at a doorway that forced Elias to squeeze past Torvin's massive frame, while the Draelith grinned down at him. Elias reported nothing. Lyra begged him to file a complaint with Instructor Vaughn, but Elias shook his head and said, "It will not help. His family is on the Security Council. A complaint from a provisional species against a Kale will disappear." "Then what will you do?" "Nothing, unless I have to. And if you have to." Elias did not answer that question. The moment that changed something small but important happened on a Tuesday station time, in the corridor outside the language lab, when Torvin stepped directly into Elias's path and shoved him with one massive palm flat against the chest. Elias hit the wall hard enough to crack the plastic panel behind him, and for a moment the air left his lungs, and white stars burst across his vision, and the pain sang through his ribs like a struck bell. Torvin stood over him, grinning, waiting for the collapse, waiting for the Earthborn boy to slide down the wall and sit on the floor and hold his chest and look up with wet eyes the way every other small species had done before him. Elias did not collapse. He braced one hand against the wall and pushed himself upright and stood there, breathing steadily, looking directly into Torvin's eyes, and he did not say a word, and he did not raise a hand, and he did not look away. Something happened in Torvin's expression then, something quick and subtle that most observers would have missed. A flicker behind those slit pupils that was not quite fear, but was perhaps the very first cousin of it. The faint, uncomfortable recognition that something was not behaving the way it was supposed to behave. The Earthborn boy should have fallen. He did not fall. Torvin held the stare for 3 long seconds, and then turned and walked away with his clique trailing behind him. And Elias stood alone in the corridor, with a bruise already forming across his chest, and his hands perfectly still at his sides. Later that night, Lyra found him in the gym, and watched from the doorway as he worked the heavy bag, with strikes that made the chain rattle, and the bag swing in wide, violent arcs. And she could feel his emotions radiating like heat from a furnace, controlled and vast and terrifying in their depth. "You are not what they think you are," she said softly. Elias caught the bag and held it still, and looked at her with sweat running down his face, and his knuckles red and raw. "No," he said, "I am not." Had never heard from any species in all her years on Nexus 7. Not anger, and not pride, and not threat. It was sorrow. The sorrow of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, and wished with all their heart that they would never have to prove it. The atrium of Nexus 7 was the heart of the station, a vast open space, 3 decks high, with a transparent ceiling that showed the slow wheel of stars beyond. And on social evenings, it filled with students from every species, clusters of color and noise and movement, and the air hummed with a dozen different languages, overlapping like waves in a tide pool. Elias had not wanted to come. Lyra had insisted, pulling at his arm with her thin, luminous fingers, and saying that he could not spend every evening alone in the gym or his quarters. That isolation was its own kind of poison. And Elias had looked at her glowing amber skin and her wide, worried eyes, and thought of his mother, who used to say the same thing in different words, and he had given in. So he sat at a small table near the edge of the atrium with Lyra and 2 other human students, a girl named Priya and a boy named Tomas, and they talked quietly and drank something fizzy and sweet that the station's food synthesizer called Terran Citrus Blend, and which tasted like orange soda that had been described to someone who had never tasted orange soda. The atrium was busy and loud, and Torvin Kale was at its center. He stood near the main fountain with his clique around him, all Draelith, and a few Kale Vryn who orbited the group like satellites. And Torvin was louder than usual, his voice carrying that particular frequency of someone who wanted to be heard by everyone. And Elias noticed that Torvin was drinking a mild intoxicant that his species favored, something fermented and amber that he poured from a flask into a cup the size of a human soup bowl. Elias watched him for a moment and then looked away, and tried to focus on the conversation at his table, but the back of his neck prickled with the old animal awareness that his uncle had taught him to trust, the awareness that said, someone is watching you, and they are deciding something. 20 minutes passed. Torvin's shadow fell across the table like a whip's. He was enormous up close, even more so than usual, because the intoxicant had loosened something in his posture, and he stood at his full height, with all four arms hanging loose, and his head tilted at an angle that said he was enjoying himself. And behind him, his clique fanned out in a loose semicircle that blocked the nearest exit. "Lyra," Torvin said, and his voice was velvet wrapped around gravel. "I have been meaning to ask you something." Lyra's skin went pale, the bioluminescence dimming to almost nothing, which Elias had learned was the Veli equivalent of going white with fear. "What do you want, Torvin?" she said. "I want to understand," Torvin said, spreading his upper arms in a gesture of false curiosity. "Why a Veli of your standing chooses to sit with these?" And he waved one lower hand at the human students, the way someone might gesture at an unpleasant stain on a carpet. "Lyra, you sit among provisional creatures and share their synthesized drink, and pretend they are your equals. It is embarrassing. It reflects poorly on your lineage." The table went very quiet. Priya looked down at her hands, and Tomas stared straight ahead with his jaw locked, and Lyra's skin flickered between pale and amber, and her hands trembled slightly on the table. Elias stood up. He did it slowly, not fast, not dramatically, just a calm unfolding from his chair until he was standing. And even standing he barely reached Torvin's chest, a fact that seemed to amuse the Draelith immensely, because a grin spread across his scaled face, showing rows of teeth that were each the length of a human finger. "Walk away," Elias said. His voice was level and quiet, and carried no anger, and no threat, and no fear. Just two words delivered with the same tone a person might use to tell someone the time. Torvin looked down at him, and the grin widened. "Did you say to me?" "I said, walk away. You have had your fun. Leave her alone and walk away." The atrium was going quiet now, tables falling silent one by one as heads turned and conversations died, and a Marathi student near the fountain let out a low subsonic rumble that Elias felt in his teeth, a sound that in Marathi body language meant something like danger nearby. Torvin laughed, a deep booming sound that bounced off the atrium walls, and he looked back at his clique, and they laughed too, because that was their function. And then he turned back to Elias, and the laughter stopped, and his eyes went flat and cold. "Little Earther," he said, "you forget your place." And then he reached down with his upper right hand and grabbed Elias by the collar of his uniform, and lifted him off the ground. It was effortless, the way a person might pick up a kitten, Torvin's arm barely flexing as he raised Elias until his feet dangled and their eyes were level. The fabric of Elias's collar pulled tight against his throat, and the station's artificial gravity pulled at his body, and Torvin held him there like a trophy, like a thing, like proof that some creatures were simply less. The atrium was silent now, hundreds of students watching, and Torvin's face was so close that Elias could count the scales around his eyes and smell the sour-sweet intoxicant on his breath. "What are you going to do, little Earther?" Torvin whispered. Elias looked into his eyes, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not with fury or battle cry, just a quiet shift, like a door closing, like the last tumbler of a lock falling into place. And years later, when other students described that moment, they would all say the same thing, that the Earthborn boy's eyes went calm in a way that was worse than anger. Calm the way deep water is calm. Calm the way the ground is calm before it opens. What happened next took 4 seconds. The first second, Elias did not reach for Torvin's wrist to pry it away the way instinct would demand. Instead, his hands came up together and clamped onto Torvin's forearm and twisted, not pulling but rotating, leveraging the joint against its own structure in a direction that Dreolith anatomy was never designed to accommodate. And the sound it made was like a green stick bending past its limit, and Torvin's grip on the collar broke instantly as his fingers sprang open in reflexive pain, and Elias dropped. In the second second, Elias did not fall. He drove downward, converting the drop into momentum the way his uncle had taught him 1,000 times on the cracked rubber floor of a gym in Nairobi. And his right elbow came down like a hammer onto the nerve cluster on the inner surface of Torvin's lower left arm, a bundle of tissue that the station's biology database listed as moderately sensitive, but which under the focused impact of an Earthborn elbow backed by muscle and bone, forged under one full gravity of relentless pressure, simply stopped working, and the arm went dead and dropped to Torvin's side like a severed cable. In the third second, Torvin swung, his upper left arm coming around in a massive clawed arc that carried enough force to crack a bulkhead, and that would have torn a lesser creature in half. But Elias was already inside the arc, stepping forward instead of back, closing the distance to nothing so that the blow sailed past him and struck only air. And from that close range, he drove his knee upward into Torvin's midsection with every ounce of mass and speed his body could produce. And Torvin's abdominal wall, which had evolved on a world with 60% of Earth's gravity, and had never once been struck by anything that carried the density of a one-gravity predator, simply folded, and something inside gave way with a wet, muffled sound. In the fourth second, Torvin doubled over, his body curling forward involuntarily, caught the back of his head with one hand, fingers gripping the ridge of scales at the base of Torvin's skull, and pulled his face downward into a rising knee that met his jaw with a sound like a stone hitting wet clay. The jaw broke in 3 places. Torvin hit the floor of the atrium, and the impact shook the tables nearest to him, and he lay there on the cold metal, making a sound that no one in that room had ever heard a Dreolith make. Not a roar, and not a growl, and not a snarl, but a thin, high whimper, a sound of something broken beyond pride, and beyond posture, and beyond any pretense of strength. Elias stood over him. His hands were still raised, guard position, muscle memory holding him in a stance drilled into his body since childhood. And his breathing was controlled and even, and his heart rate had barely changed, and after 3 seconds, he lowered his hands slowly to his sides and looked down at Torvin with an expression that held no triumph and no satisfaction and no rage. It held sadness. The atrium was so silent that Elias could hear the hum of the station's life support systems and the soft, distant turning of the stars beyond the glass ceiling. Then, station security arrived, and the world began to move again. They put Torvin Kale in the medical bay, and the doctors worked on him for 6 hours. His jaw had fractured in 3 places along the mandibular ridge where the bone was thinnest, and the biomedical team had to remove fragments and rebuild the structure with a scaffold of synthetic calcium and biofoam that would need months to fully integrate. and during those months he would not be able to chew or bite or open his mouth beyond a narrow gap. And so a nutrient tube was inserted through a small incision in his throat that connected to a feed line running directly to his stomach. He would eat through that tube for 4 months. His lower left arm had sustained nerve damage at the cluster point where the Earthborn boy's elbow had landed. And the doctors said that full motor function would return eventually, but not soon and not without pain. And his abdominal wall had partially torn where the knee had connected. An injury that on most species would have been fatal, but which, on a Draelith, was merely agonizing. He was conscious through all of it, because Draelith could not be safely sedated with standard anesthetics, and the sounds that came from the medical bay during those 6 hours made the security officers standing outside the door shift their weight and look at their feet. Elias was placed in a holding room, a small gray space with a table and 2 chairs and nothing else, and he sat with his hands folded in front of him and waited. And when the security officers came to question him, he answered every question calmly and completely, and did not ask for anything except a glass of water. The formal inquiry was convened 2 days later in the station's administrative wing, a curved room with high ceilings and a tribunal panel consisting of 3 senior instructors from 3 different species: Instructor Vaughn the Thessic, a Marathi diplomat named Kor, and a Veli elder named Salen, whose bioluminescence was a steady deep blue that suggested absolute focus. The Kale family responded within hours. Torvin's father, a Draelith named Oren Kale, who held a senior seat on the Concord Security Council, transmitted a formal demand for Elias's immediate expulsion and criminal prosecution under Concord Statute 17, which governed unprovoked assault between species, and the language of the demand was sharp and absolute, and carried the unspoken weight of a family that was accustomed to getting what it wanted. The word Deathworld Primitive appeared 4 times in the filing. Elias was assigned a student advocate, a Thessic junior administrator who seemed nervous and uncertain, and who told Elias that cases involving Draelith families rarely went well for the other side. "I understand," Elias said. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "Yes, but I will say it at the hearing." The hearing took place on the 3rd day, and the tribunal chamber was full, students packed into the observation gallery in numbers that the administrators had not anticipated, species that normally had no interest in Concord judicial process suddenly finding it fascinating. And the reason was simple. Word had spread across the station like fire through dry grass. The story of the Earthborn boy who had put a Draelith on the floor in 4 seconds, and everyone wanted to see what happened next. Elias sat at the respondents' table in a clean uniform with his hands folded and his face composed. And when it was his turn to speak, he stood and addressed the tribunal in a voice that did not waver. He described the first day Torvin had spoken about humans in the dining hall. He described the shoulder checks in the corridors. He described the tray knocked from his hands and the shove that cracked a wall panel, and the verbal harassment that had continued for weeks in front of dozens of witnesses who had done nothing. He described the moment in the atrium when Torvin had insulted Lyra and then grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground like an object. He described what he did next, and he did not minimize it, and he did not embellish it, and when he was finished, he sat down. Lyra testified next, and her skin glowed a steady white that in Veli culture signified truth-telling under oath. And she confirmed everything Elias had said and added details he had left out: the pattern of intimidation, the targeting of smaller species, the culture of silence that Torvin had cultivated through the implicit threat of his family's name. Then other students came forward. A Pilkeen who said Torvin had stolen his food for weeks and called him vermin. A young Thessic who said Torvin had cracked one of her leg segments in a corridor and told her to report it if she dared. 2 Veli who said they had changed their schedules to avoid crossing Torvin's path, and a Marathi who said that the subsonic distress calls in the corridors had become so frequent that the younger students had simply stopped going to certain parts of the station. One by one they came, and one by one they spoke, and the tribunal panel listened in silence that grew heavier with each testimony. The station's AI was called upon to provide surveillance footage, and the footage was clear and unambiguous. It showed Torvin initiating physical contact in the atrium. It showed him lifting Elias off the ground by the collar, and it showed the 4 seconds that followed in high-definition, multi-angle clarity. The tribunal watched it 3 times. Then came the testimony that changed everything. A woman walked into the tribunal chamber, and she wore the dark blue uniform of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and her name was Commander Adazi Obi, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 20 years representing humanity in places where humanity was not always welcome, and the fact that she had arrived at Nexus 7 within 48 hours of the incident suggested to everyone in the room that Earth had been watching its students more closely than anyone had realized. Commander Obi requested permission to provide expert context on human biology and capability, and the tribunal granted it. She stood before the panel and activated a holo display of her own, and spoke in clear, measured language that was designed to be understood by every species in the room. She explained that Earth was a 1G world, which placed it in the upper 15% of inhabited planets by gravitational pull. She explained that human muscle fiber was approximately 40% denser than Dralith muscle fiber pound for pound, and that human bone density exceeded Dralith bone density by a factor of 1.5. She explained that human connective tissue, tendons and ligaments, had evolved under constant gravitational stress, and was among the most resilient organic material catalogued by the Concord's biological surveys. She explained that humans were persistent predators, evolved to outlast anything they could not outfight, capable of sustained physical output over periods that most galactic species would consider impossible. And then she said the thing that made the entire room go cold. The tribunal should be aware, Commander Obi said, that the respondent exercised significant restraint during the incident in question. The strikes he employed were targeted at non-lethal anatomical points: the jaw, the nerve cluster, the abdominal wall. These are disabling targets. A trained Earthborn human striking to kill against Dralith anatomy would target the cervical ridge or the tracheal plate, either of which would result in immediate death. Elias Mwangi did not strike to kill, he struck to stop, and the tribunal should weigh that distinction carefully. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. The ruling was as follows. Elias Mwangi had acted in self-defense after sustained provocation and direct physical aggression. The response was proportional to the threat, and the respondent had demonstrated restraint consistent with defensive rather than offensive intent. No charges would be filed, no expulsion would occur. Torvin Kale was suspended from classes for the remainder of the term, and his family was formally notified that any attempt to retaliate through political channels would be met with a full public release of the testimony and evidence gathered during the inquiry. The Kale family was furious, but there was nothing they could do. Elias walked out of the tribunal chamber, and Lyra was waiting in the corridor, and she looked at him with her wide, dark eyes, glowing a soft, relieved blue, and she said, "It is over." Elias looked at her, and tried to smile, and almost managed it. "No," he said quietly, "it is just different now." To his quarters alone, and sat on the edge of his bunk, and pressed his palms against his eyes, and stayed like that for a very long time, not moving, not speaking, carrying the weight of what he had done, and the heavier weight of knowing that in 4 seconds he had become something he had never wanted to be. He had become a warning. The change came slowly, the way weather changes on a station that has no weather. Not with a dramatic shift, but with a gradual turning of pressure that you only noticed when you stopped and paid attention. In the first week after the tribunal, the corridors felt different. Students moved aside when Elias walked past, not dramatically and not with obvious fear, but with a small unconscious adjustment of position, the way water parts around a stone. And Elias noticed it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about a thing that was already done. The other human students noticed it too. Priya told him that a Kael'Vryn student, who had never spoken to her before, held a door open and nodded at her as she passed. And Tomas said that a group of Dreylas, who used to block the corridor outside the lab, now stepped aside without being asked. And the third human student, a quiet boy from Sao Paulo named Rafael, said that for the first time since arriving at Nexus 7, he was greeted by a student he had never met, a tall and silent Kael'Vryn girl who looked over her shoulder as she left the corridor. He had eaten a full meal in the dining hall without looking over his shoulder. Priya said to Elias, "You did that," Elias said. "I broke someone's jaw," Elias said. "That is not the same thing." But it was, or at least it was connected, the way a crack in a dam is connected to the flood that follows. Not the same event, but born from the same moment. Torvin returned to classes 3 weeks later. He looked different. Not smaller exactly, because a Drealith could not look small, but reduced in some fundamental way. His posture slightly hunched, his forearms held closer to his body, his jaw wired shut beneath a sheath of medical biofoam that made the lower half of his face look swollen and wrong. And the nutrient tube ran from a port in his throat to a small pump unit clipped to his belt that hummed faintly when it delivered the liquid meals that were now his only source of sustenance. He did not speak, because he could not speak. Not clearly, only a wet, slurred mumble. That made the words pile up against each other like traffic on a broken road. And so he was silent, and the silence was its own kind of punishment, because Torvin had always been loudest in every room, and now he was the quietest. He did not look at Elias. He did not look at anyone. He walked to his classes and sat in the back, and did his work, and walked back to his quarters, and the clique that had once surrounded him like a court surrounding a king had quietly dissolved, its members drifting to other tables and other groups and other allegiances with the easy faithlessness of people who had only ever followed strength, and now saw that the strength they had followed was not the strongest thing in the room. Some of Torvin's former followers now sat at mixed species tables, shoulder to shoulder with Pilkeen and Veli, and even humans. And whether they did this out of genuine change or simple self-preservation was impossible to tell. And perhaps it did not matter. The result was the same. The walls were coming down. The smaller species noticed. A delegation of Pilkeen students approached Elias one afternoon in the library, 3 of them standing in a nervous cluster, their soft-furred bodies barely reaching his waist, and the eldest of them said in a voice like rustling paper that they wanted to know if the human students would sit with them at meals, because they had been eating alone for 2 years, and they were tired of being alone. Elias said yes before they finished asking. Lyra watched all of this, with her wide dark eyes, and her skin glowing a warm and steady gold that meant something between happiness and hope, and she said to Elias one evening, "You have changed the ecology of this station." I did not mean to. I know, that is why it worked. The weeks passed, and Elias fell into a routine that was almost normal. Classes and meals, and evenings in the gym, and long conversations with Lyra on the mind. Observation deck, where they watched distant stars and talked about home and family and the strange business of being young in a galaxy that did not always want you. But the ripples of what had happened in the atrium did not stay inside Nexus 7. Elias learned this on a Tuesday, when Commander Obi contacted him through the station's secure communication channel and asked him to meet her virtually. And when her face appeared on his screen, she looked at him with an expression that was part pride and part something more complicated. "The incident has been noted at the Concord level," she said. A summary was included in the latest interspecies conduct briefing. No names were used, but the details are specific enough that anyone who wants to know will find out. What does that mean for me? For you personally, nothing. You are protected under the tribunal ruling, but for humans more broadly, she paused and something that might have been a smile crossed her face. The Concord Biological Database has been updated. There is a new advisory note under Homo sapiens. She read it to him. Despite small stature and provisional Concord status, Earthborn humans should not be engaged physically. Their homeworld gravity, pain tolerance, and culturally ingrained combat training make them disproportionately dangerous in close encounters. Recommend diplomatic de-escalation. Elias sat with that for a long moment. Disproportionately dangerous, he repeated. You sound unhappy about it. I did not come here to be dangerous. I came here to learn. Commander Obi looked at him through the screen with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent 2 decades navigating a galaxy that respected teeth over words, and she said, "Sometimes, Elias, the lesson you teach is more important than the one you came to learn." The connection ended, and Elias sat alone in his quarters and thought about that, and decided he did not agree. Also could not argue. The last thing that happened, the thing that made it all mean something, happened on an ordinary morning 6 weeks after the atrium. Elias was walking to his first class through the main corridor of Residential Block 9 when he saw a new student standing near the entrance checkpoint, looking lost and frightened in the particular way that only a new arrival on a station full of strangers can look, small and uncertain and trying very hard to be invisible. The new student was Kellish, an amphibian species from a low-gravity water world with smooth blue-green skin and large dark eyes and a body barely 3 feet tall that seemed built from glass and good intentions. And he clutched a datapad to his chest like a shield and looked at the stream of larger species flowing past him with an expression that Elias recognized because he had worn it himself not so long ago. A group of students, not Drelith, but large enough and loud enough to fill a corridor, noticed the Kellish boy and slowed and exchanged glances, and one of them said something in a language Elias did not speak, but whose tone was universal. The tone of someone identifying easy prey. Elias did not think about what to do next, he simply did it. He walked to the Kellish boy and stood beside him. Not in front of him and not behind him, but beside him. Shoulder to metaphorical shoulder given the height difference. And he did not say anything to the group of larger students. He just stood there. A 14-year-old human boy from Nairobi who weighed 130 pounds and who had once dropped a 7-foot Dralith warrior in 4 seconds. The group of larger students looked at him. They recognized him. Everyone on the station recognized him now, and whatever calculation they were running behind their eyes reached its conclusion quickly, because they looked at each other, and then looked away, and then kept walking, as if the Kellish boy had never existed. Elias watched them go, and then looked down at the new student who was staring up at him with those huge dark eyes, full of something that was too complex to be simple gratitude. "What is your name?" Elias asked. "Pelin," the boy said in a small, wet voice. "I am Elias. Come on, Pelin, I will show you where the dining hall is." They walked together down the corridor, the Earthborn boy and the Waterworld boy, and Lyra appeared from a side passage and fell into step beside them without a word, her skin glowing a warm, steady gold, and the 3 of them moved through the stream of alien life like a small, quiet current that had decided to flow in its own direction. Above them, the stars turned slowly beyond the glass, and somewhere in the vast databases of the Galactic Concord, a new line of text sat beneath the entry for Homo sapiens, a warning and a recognition and a grudging admission that the galaxy's measurement of strength had been missing something all along. Not size, and not claws, and not venom, and not armor. Something smaller, and quieter, and heavier. The weight of Earth, carried in small frames and steady hands, and the absolute unshakable refusal to look away. and on a medical ward 2 levels above, Torvin Kale sat on the edge of his bed and held the nutrient tube that ran into his throat, and stared at the wall, and swallowed the liquid that was his breakfast, and his lunch, and his dinner, and his reminder. 4 months of reminder, delivered in steady mechanical pulses, that the smallest creature in the room had been the most dangerous thing he had ever touched. He had reached down and grabbed the boy by the collar, because he thought it would be easy. Nothing about it had been easy. Nothing about it would ever be easy again.